Just a second. Oh, cut and paste. You know how it goes. So we're waiting for YouTube to come up. We're on. All right, good. Welcome to anybody who's watching by way of YouTube today or who will watch this study today at some point during the rest of the week. And I've just handed out to the folks here, for those of you on YouTube, a timeline of Paul's ministry. And just to go over that with you all that are here, again, you see Paul's conversion, as we talked about, looking at that line of Acts, somewhere, between 32 and 35 AD. You read about that in chapter 9 of Acts. The latter portion of chapter 9 in Acts talks about his post-conversion formation and early ministry in various places. The Antioch ministry in chapter 11 there, and you see the dating. So you see all that down at the bottom. Let me call your attention to down at the bottom of that front side of the page. And the thing that's really disputed or is debated, and scholars, go into great detail trying to figure out, the book of Acts ends with Paul going to Rome the first time. And we don't know what happened to Paul in Rome. We don't know, and when nobody ever really tells us. Well, church tradition, that is after the apostles, the time of the apostles, church tradition paints a sketch out, and it's been, embraced by a lot of the early church leaders after the time of the apostles, that Paul, was acquitted his first imprisonment in Rome. He wasn't found guilty of anything, and so they let him go. And so he ended up doing basically a fourth missionary journey, and went about from the year 63 to 65 doing that. And it's during that time that he wrote 1 Timothy, and then he wrote Titus, and then he ends up being imprisoned a second time, roughly those years 66 through 67. That would be the time that Nero is the emperor in Rome, and you've heard, we've talked about how Nero was vicious in his persecution of the Christians, and so it makes sense that Paul would have died under Nero's reign. So it's thought that, and we know that 2 Timothy is written during that second imprisonment time. He's facing death, he's expecting death, and he's asking Timothy to come see him soon to be able to say goodbye to him before he dies. So that, again, we don't have any biblical authentication for it other than what you read in the letters from 1st, 2nd Timothy and Titus. But that's what church tradition beyond the first apostles speculates and says. Or not, that's what was passed on to them. They were passing it on as what happened outside the biblical witness. Anyway, but again, we're talking roughly for Paul's life, 32 to 35 to the mid-60s. And then a couple of years earlier, of course, is Christ and the events that happened with Christ and the Pentecost Sunday. Acts, remember, starts with Christ after the resurrection, and he's ministering to the apostles, the disciples, and then he ascends to the Father, and then chapter 2 is Pentecost Sunday. So, again, roughly 30 to 35 years, somewhere in that time frame. But this is a good thing, and I pulled this from some resources. I didn't have to go too far to do much on that. But this is and as I said in that little paragraph at the top, you'll get a lot of debate on a lot of these things among scholars, and they'll have all sorts of reasons why, and we could spend a year talking about all that, and we're not going to. But this is a general representation of the understood view of things related to Paul and his ministry. So anyway, I think that's helpful to have. I've given you an outline before, and I think that's helpful. Again, that was a great question, and it prompted us to take a good look at some of those things. So, all right, we're in chapter 21, finishing up chapter 21 and going into chapter 22. And as we've had in some other times, what we've got is a lot of dialogue. We remember what we said last week, and where we ended last week. Paul was headed to Jerusalem. His story echoes Jesus' story. He's going to Jerusalem. He feels the need to go to Jerusalem. He knows he's going to suffer persecution, but he's still going to go to Jerusalem. That's what God is calling him to do. And so he's going to Jerusalem. Chapters 21 through the end of the book deal with his being in Jerusalem, his ended up in prison in Caesarea, and taking off from Caesarea to Rome to go before Caesar. That's what he wants to do. He wants to witness before Caesar for the gospel. That's his hope in going to Rome. So we're picking up where we left off last week. He had come to Jerusalem. The leaders there got him to participate in a Nazirite vow ceremony. Not sure exactly how he did it. He participated in some respects and supported it in others. And he did this in a public way so that everybody would be able to see and know that, he was acting in good conscience with respect to the Jewish way and tradition. The leaders in the church at Jerusalem wanted to spare him persecution if at all possible. And so Paul does all this, but as we start to read here, it doesn't do the trick. So we pick up in chapter 21, picking up with verse 27. When the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, who had seen him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd. Let's stop there and say these Jews from Asia, number one, were probably some of those in Ephesus. While Paul was there, remember, Paul was always in trouble with the Jewish contingent in all those cities. They were always stirring up riots against him and trying to get him arrested and all that kind of stuff. So these are Jews who have seen him in action on the mission field, and they see him in Jerusalem. They're in Jerusalem most likely for the festival of Pentecost. Remember, Paul wanted to be in Jerusalem by Pentecost. We said that earlier in what we read. And so it's the festival of Pentecost, and these Jews from Asia are there to celebrate the festival, and they see Paul, and it makes their blood boil all over again. Verse 27, 28. They seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against our people, our law, and this place. More than that, he has actually brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city. That's how we know they're from Ephesus. They've seen Trophimus, who is with Paul. He is a Gentile. And they suppose that Paul had brought him into the temple. Paul's been in the temple, remember, for these purification rites related to the Nazirite vow. They suppose that he brought Trophimus in with him because Trophimus has been with him in all sorts of other circumstances. But again, whether they did or didn't, it works well, right? He's an enemy to the faith. He's trying to do away with the faith, and now he's brought this Greek into the temple. We know he has to desecrate it. Verse 30. Then all the city was aroused, and the people rushed together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. Stop there for just a second. Immediately the doors were shut. The gates leading into the inner court of the temple is what's referenced there. They seized Paul, dragged him out of the temple precincts. Remember, when you're in the temple, you're in the courtyard around the temple. Nobody goes into the Holy of Holies except the priests, or the holy place except the priests. But they closed off the gates to the inner court so that to keep him from getting back in there, or to push everything out into the courtyard. Any kind of trouble out into the courtyard, where that kind of thing could be tolerated, I guess. Verse 31. While they were trying to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Israel was in an uproar. Immediately he took soldiers and centurions, ran down to them. When they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came, arrested him, that is Paul, and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, some another, and as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. When Paul came to the steps, the violence of the mob was so great that he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Away with him!" That last verse sounds so much like the gospel accounts of Jesus, right? Crucify him. When Jesus, Pilate comes and wants to release Jesus, and they say, "No, give us Barabbas instead." And they say, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." Well, Paul is experiencing his own version of that. As they're taking him into the barracks of the fortress there, they're crying, "Away with him, away with him," after they've already tried to kill him. Back up and think about this. There was a Roman garrison not far from the temple. It was within fairly short running distance. You ran up a couple of set of stairs, and you were from the garrison up into the temple court area. So when word got to the tribune, the Roman official over the garrison, that there was trouble in the temple, number one, it probably didn't surprise him. That's why they were so close to the temple. And number two, he got his soldiers out there in lickety-split time. So they come up, and of course, as soon as they get there, they see the crowds beating Paul. They are beating Paul. They want to kill Paul. It's not a pretty scene. But when they see the soldiers coming, they stop because they know that Rome is in charge, and they know that if they're unruly, it's just going to mean they're going to be tamped down upon by the Romans more and more. And so they know they've got to behave when there's somebody watching, when the police have shown up. And so they stop. And the tribune, the leading official, comes forward and tries to figure out what's going on. We're going to see in the next section of verses that he suspects that Paul is a particular individual, and I'll read you something about that in just a second. A troublemaker somebody who several years before had tried to raise up a revolution among the Jews to lead them up in revolt against the Romans. That, of course, was always the Romans' fear. Somebody's going to try and stir them up and have them, lead a war against us. And of course, that's going to happen within the next 10 years. So it's not unfounded on Rome's part that they're anxious about this type of thing. But that's why they act so quickly here. And again, that's why the Jews stop when they see the Romans show up. So he immediately arrests Paul before the crowd because he assumes that Paul is the guilty party. And he assumes something we're going to read about in just a second about Paul. He puts chains on him, and he asks the crowd, "Okay, what's he doing? What's wrong? What's the problem here?" Well, again, kind of like Jesus's, when they bring Jesus before the Sanhedrin, when they bring Jesus before the Roman officials, they get 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 different stories about what Jesus has done wrong. Well, that's the same thing they're getting with Paul, except they're right in the middle of the crowd, and the crowd's already stirred up and angry. And so the tribune can't get a good answer what Paul has done that's stirred up all this trouble. So he says, take him away to the barracks. That is, take him into the fortress. Again, we're talking, very short distance from the Temple Mount down into the fortress, the Roman garrison. And so they're going to take him in and sequester him for questioning down there. So that's where we are to this point in this drama. Okay, Paul, Paul has been, once he's been seen by the Asian Jews, he's been seized, he's been beaten. The mob is trying to kill him, wants to kill him, but the Roman soldiers show up. The cavalry shows up just in time, and Paul's life is spared for the second. Go to the next section of scripture passages. Just as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, that is, into the garrison, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" The tribune replied, "Do you know Greek?" Now that means, of course, that Paul is speaking Greek to the tribune, okay? So that's the first clue. The tribune has some idea of who Paul is, who he thinks he is, and it ain't the same thing as who Paul actually is. Do you know Greek? Then you are not the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more depth here in just a second. Paul replied, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of an important city. I beg you, let me speak to the people. Let's stop there for just a second. The guy he thinks he is, I've got a commentator, scholar commentator, who writes about that. Some 3 years previously, an Egyptian adventurer appeared in Jerusalem claiming to be a prophet, and he led a large band of followers out to the Mount of Olives. There he told them to wait until, at his word of command, the walls of the city would fall flat. Then they would march in, overthrow the Roman garrison, and take possession of the place. You know, the walls of Jericho fall down, right? It's the same thing as what happened way back then. That's what he's saying is going to happen. But Felix, procurator of Judea, sent a body of troops against them. They killed several and took others prisoner. The Egyptian himself discreetly disappeared. Those whom he had duped would cherish no friendly feelings toward him. Now, thought the tribune, the impostor had reappeared, and the people were venting their rage on him. Okay, so you get what his working assumption probably was. He was this revolutionary from Egypt who had come in and stirred up the Jews and said, we're going to throw off Roman rule and wait for my command, and when the walls fall down, then we're going to rush in and defeat the Romans. Well, what happened was the Romans sent troops and arrested people and killed some and foiled the whole plot. Well, this guy takes off back to Egypt. And so this tribune thinks this is the same guy come back because everybody's in a rage, right? They're angry with Paul. Why would they be angry with Paul? Because he duped them that first time and got them in trouble. So that's his working assumption. That's what he thinks. But when he hears Paul speak in Greek to him, he knows it's not the same guy because that guy was just a peasant kind of guy, an outsider kind of guy. So he knows that it's not the same guy. Back to the passage, verse 39. But Paul replied, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of an important city. I beg you, let me speak to the people. Let me speak to the people. When he had given him permission, Paul stood on the steps of the garrison and motioned to the people for silence. Imagine that, right? They want to kill him, and he's standing up there, and he's trying to get him to quiet down, right? That's not working. Well, at least not right off the bat. When there was a hush, he addressed them in Hebrew, saying. So he's speaking to them in their own language, right? And this gets them to quiet down even more. Brothers and fathers, listen to the defense that I now make before you. When they heard him addressing them in Hebrew, they became even more quiet. Then he said, I am a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel. That's no small thing. Big teacher, right? Gamaliel, big rabbi. I was brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel. I was brought up in Jerusalem at the feet of Gamaliel, one of the top rabbis. Educated strictly according to our ancestral law, being zealous for God, just as all of you are today. I'm one of you, he's trying to say to them. I persecuted this way, that is the church. Remember, the way is the wording that was used to refer to the church early on. I persecuted this way up to the point of death. In other words, I was killing Christians by binding both men and women and putting them in prison. As the high priest and the whole council of elders can testify about me. He's known. He's got character references in there. Yeah, he did try to kill the Christians. I remember that now. From them, I also received letters to the brothers in Damascus, and I went there in order to bind those who were there, that is, bind Christians, and to bring them back to Jerusalem for punishment. I was right in the middle of trying to do the very work you're trying to do. While I was on my way and approaching Damascus about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone about me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? I answered, Who are you, Lord? Then he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now, pay attention to that verse right there, verse 8. I answered, Who are you, Lord? He hears a voice. He assumes who's speaking. God, right? I answered, Who are you, Lord? In other words, what do you want with me, Lord? What are you saying to me, Lord? What are you doing, Lord? He's speaking to God. And what does he hear? The words, I am Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus is God, is what Paul is saying here. And what he's saying is, I found out at that moment that Jesus is God. Now, you know how that's going to go over with these guys, right? But anyway, I answered, Who are you, Lord? Then he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. In a way, he's saying to the Jews, you're persecuting God too, by the way. I was persecuting God by persecuting the believers. Then he said to, now those who were with me saw the light, but did not hear the voice of the one who was speaking to me. I asked, What am I to do, Lord? The Lord said to me, Get up and go to Damascus. There you will be told everything that has been assigned to you to do. Since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, those who were with me took my hand and led me to Damascus. A certain Ananias, who was a devout man according to the law and well spoken of by all the Jews living there, came to me and standing beside me said, Brother Saul, regain your sight. In that very hour I regained my sight and saw him. Then he said, The God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will, to see the righteous one, that's another phrase for the Messiah, and to hear his own voice. For you will be his witness to all the world of what you have seen and heard. And now why do you delay? Get up, be baptized, and have your sins washed away, calling on his name. Calling on the name of who? Jesus, who is God. After I returned to Jerusalem, and while I was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw Jesus saying to me, Hurry and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And while the blood of your witness Stephen was shed, I myself was standing by, approving and keeping the coats of those who killed him. Then Jesus said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. That's what he preaches to that crowd right then and there. That's as far as this sermon goes. But it's an incredible thing. Astounding thing. Again, get the feel for this whole situation. Paul shows up out in the middle of, comes out of the temple. The Jews from Asia sees him. They rile up a mob against him. They take him out of the courtyard, shut the gates, which is really a symbolic way of saying you're not welcome here anymore. And they want to do away with him. They're taking him out and getting ready to hang him, stone him, do whatever to kill him. The Roman guards come out having heard about it, and they stop things right then and there. But they take him into the garrison where they want to take him into the garrison where they'll question him. But before they go in, Paul says, no, let me speak to the people. And so he gets the chance to speak to the people, and he tries to make his defense before them. It's an amazing scene. It really, really, really is. We read over these words and it just doesn't jump up at us like it ought to. But it's an amazing thing. And I think it is primarily because Paul thought he really could convince them. I'm one of you, he was saying to them. I am a Jew. I was brought up under Gamaliel in Jerusalem. I learned the true Jewish tradition, and I was zealous for the law. I'm a Pharisee. And I wanted to persecute these people I thought were blasphemers, these Christians. But while I was on the way to do that, this happened to me. So Paul was trying to, get them to see what had happened to him and to believe it, or at least to consider it. But it doesn't stop the crowd from wanting to kill him still. Next section of verses. Up to this point, they listened to him. Up to this point, up to those last words, up to the words he said that Jesus told him to go to the Gentiles because the Jews were rejecting him. Like I said, goes over like a lead balloon, right? Up to this point, they listened to him, but then they shouted, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." Those are mighty, powerful words there. And while they were shouting, throwing off their cloaks, and tossing dust in the air, the tribune directed that he was to be brought into the barracks and ordered him to be examined by flogging. That's shorthand for torture, right? We'll get him to talk. It's an interrogation, right? Interrogation by torture. To find out the reason for this outcry against him. But when they had tied him up with straps, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman person who is uncondemned?" That's a neat phrase right there. That's one that ought to make you stop. It's almost a comic phrase. Do you think it's a good idea to flog a Roman citizen who has no charge against him by the Roman courts? You might ought to think this one through, boys. He pulls out the I'm a Roman citizen card. We've seen him do it before, and he does it here. Notice he didn't pull it out to start with. He tried to convince the Romans. He tried to preach the gospel to them and tried to get them to consider the truthfulness of his experience. But when it came time for the Romans to take him down and beat the you-know-what out of him in the garrison, make an example of him, he then says that, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman person who is uncondemned?" When the centurion heard that, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? This man is a Roman." The tribune came and asked Paul, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And he said, "Yes." The tribune answered, "It cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship." Paul said, "But I was born a Roman." Immediately, those who were about to examine him drew back from him, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman and that he had bound him. Since he wanted to find out what Paul was being accused of by the Jews, the next day he released him and ordered the chief priest and the entire council, the Sanhedrin, he brought Paul down and had him stand before them. So he stops the persecution of Paul. We can't do anything to this fellow until we know that there's some kind of Roman charge against him that we can act on. We can't act on a Jewish charge. That's for them to deal with. But if there's a Roman issue or Roman law that's been broken, then we can deal with them. So let's send him down to the Sanhedrin. Let's find out from them, what the charges are against him. And then if we think they're worth following up on, then we can follow up from there. But we can't do anything else with him right now. So Paul is saved, again, by the fact of his being a Roman citizen. Again, he only pulls out the card after he's tried to convince his fellow Jews of the truthfulness of his experience. The thing that I take away from all this that I would have you to think about as you go forth this day is the great anger of the Jews against Paul. If you read through that again and again and read it carefully, while they were shouting, throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust in the air, that's a great sign of lamentation and anger and being very upset. Away with such a fellow, he should not be allowed to live. Furious are the Jews against him. Now we understand that on the one hand, it's the same thing as what Jesus experienced. Paul, speaking of Jesus as God, blasphemy. Paul telling the Gentiles who want to become Christians, they don't need to become Jews. He's speaking ill of our way. He's betrayed us. And the story about him bringing Trophimus into the temple, you know how you just put that out there and everybody buys it, whether it's true or not. So they think he's desecrated the temple. They think he's an enemy to the faith. They think he's a blasphemer. He should be killed, according to Jewish law. So we understand how angry they are and why they're that angry. But the other side of that is that Paul is the one person in all the world who could have gotten them to understand, even more so than Jesus. because Paul was one of them. And yet this had happened to him, and he had turned. And so they should have at least stopped for a few minutes and considered whether there might be something truthful in all this. They didn't have to go very far to see how Paul was well known to be a hater of the church. How could that have happened? Is it true? Surely they could have stopped and at least given it a thought. They didn't. And they didn't when Jesus was around. Jesus chalked up their resistance to the gospel, their resistance to him, to their jealousy, number one. They didn't want anybody else to be winning the approval of the crowds over them. Spiritual blindness, most of it, intentional on their part. They didn't want to see anything else. They closed off their eyes. They didn't want to see anything other than what they knew, and they didn't care what signs might validate it, what Jesus was doing. There's also a sense of self-preservation, spirit of self-preservation and self-exaltation. The Jews liked being the big guys. The Pharisees, the religious leaders, they loved to be thought well of. They loved to get the seats of honor at the banquets. They loved for people to bow down before them and defer to them, and they didn't want to give that up. Paul, of course, talks about the same thing in his letter to the Philippians. In chapter 3, Paul talks about how he was the Jews' Jew. He was the Pharisees' Pharisee. He was the most devout of everybody. He had everything in the world to lose in order to come to Christ. And he did lose it. And in the very last paragraph there that I have for you on that last page, after detailing his high standing as a Pharisee in his good old days, he writes, "For Christ's sake I have suffered the loss of all things, and I regard them as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but one that comes through faith in Christ." Once again, I write here, once again we see, and we talked about this before, how the call to follow Christ is a costly one. We also see how there are many that don't want to pay that cost. The Pharisees and religious leaders, they did not want to pay that cost, most of them. And so they continued to resist, even as Jesus kept showing them that he was the Son of God. Following Jesus always involves costs. Anyway, any thoughts, questions, comments before we head out? Again, for me, reading through it and entering into the drama of that, I've read those verses again and again and again, and I just kind of read over them because it's kind of superfluous. There's no great teaching in all that, right? But man, that's powerful stuff when you sit there and really tease it out. Really, 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 really powerful stuff. And again, my admiration for Paul, for his courage, goes up every time we pick up the book of Acts. What would they have won if they listened to Jesus? Their souls. Yes. That's what Paul was saying. I gave it all up. well lost because I gained Christ. Yeah, that whole passage, Philippians chapter 3, that whole passage there is really, really good stuff too. All right, thank you all. Appreciate you being here. Everybody's fanning themselves. We need to turn the AC down, I guess. So.